Welcome to Mission Gathering. If this is your first time here, we want to extend a special welcome to you. My name is Pastor Brandon. I serve as the lead pastor here. And you've joined us for a new kickoff of a new series here in March called So You Want a Revolution. Sounds like something we've been hearing a lot these days, right? The great philosopher William Humboldt once said, "If we glance at the most important revolutions in history, we see at once that the greatest number of these originated in the periodical revolutions of the human mind." I don't know if you've looked around and noticed, but we're living in a day of political unrest and division. Our nation is divided, not just between left and right, but between a dozen different factions of peoples and parties and classes and races and religions. Democrats can't agree on a future for the country, nor can Republicans. And Christians can't agree on what following Jesus looks like in practice in this moment of history. And this unrest comes from, I believe, our inability to think clearly, to analyze problems that we're facing, and diagnose what the solution would be with any accuracy. Some people look out at the world and see certain kinds of people as the problem. Some people look at the world and see certain economic systems as the problem. Many of us look across the room and see people who have arrived at different political conclusions and think they are the problem. I don't know about you, but for me, this inability to find a solution, let alone understand and diagnose the problem, and all the infighting accompanying it, has been exhausting. It seems almost hopeless. If we can't even agree on what the problems that we're facing are, how in the world can we as a people find a real solution? And let me say clearly from the pulpit that I don't believe the real solution is a political candidate. It's far bigger than one person or even one administration. It has to do with our collective ability to agree on what is true. As Humboldt said, any revolution of a political system must first begin with a revolution of the mind. We must change our thinking, an understanding of what is ultimately true. But truth continues to evade us, doesn't it? If we want to go around this room, and if I asked each of you to think about the state of healthcare, for instance, in this nation, we would get dozens of different answers and perspectives. Or on immigration or wealth disparity. It's almost impossible to arrive at a collective common understanding of any solution because we live in an era of untruth. Misinformation and half-truths are everywhere. My mentor, a guy named Ken Wilber, once declared that we're living in a post-truth world. He actually wrote this about what we're facing. He says, "I summarize this postmodern disaster with the term aperspectival madness, because the belief that there is no truth, no perspective has universal validity, when pushed to the extremes as postmodernism was about to do, has resulted in massive self-contradictions and ultimate incoherency. And when aperspectival madness infects the leading edge of evolution, evolution's capacity for self-direction and self-organization collapses." That's a lot of words, but essentially what he's saying is that no one's perspective in this era seems to be valid or true anymore. No one's experience is actually given validity. Our world is incoherent. If you ask conservatives about the state of the world and you ask a liberal about the state of the world, you'll get fundamentally different assessments. And without a clear, agreed-upon diagnosis of the problem we face, it seems that there cannot be a solution. So we're hopeless. Happy Sunday. We can go home now. In the midst of these turbulent times, there is, after all, a ray of hope. The gospel of Jesus provides us with a reason to be optimistic and a way that we can live in this moment that can subvert the confusion and the division of our times. As we enter into the next 6 months of our nation's history, where tensions will be high and truth will be in short supply, it's my sincere hope that we, Mission Gathering, can lean in and be the people Jesus calls us to be. You have often heard me say from this pulpit that we're living in a world today that was not all that different from the world Jesus himself lived in. In Jesus' day, there were extreme divisions within culture, religion, and social classes. The very fact that Jesus himself faced so much opposition, not just from one group, but from literally every possible group in his society, each with their own unique accusations of him, shows us just how divided his day was. Everything he taught seemed to be a critique of some system or some group of people. The rich thought he was out to take their money. The poor found his message about treasures in heaven to be hollow. Political leaders thought he was attempting to take away their power, and grassroots activists were suspicious about how cozy he seemed to be with some government officials. In an era of political unrest, an era of aperspectival madness, Jesus seemed to make everyone mad. And at the same time, he had the ability, unlike anyone else, to bring people together for a better future for their lives and for our world. So as followers of Jesus, we would do well to look at the life of our rabbi and try to implement his own example and teachings in our day-to-day life. Perhaps we can take a small part in this new revolution that actually can change the way our world is working. One of the most telling stories in the life of Jesus occurs after he's been arrested by Pontius Pilate in a standing trial, literally for inciting a political revolution. Listen to this summary of John chapter 18. Then the Jewish leaders took Jesus to the palace of the Roman governor. Pilate came out to them and asked, "What are the charges you're bringing against this man? If he were not a criminal, we would not have handed him over to you," they said. Pilate went back inside the palace and summoned Jesus and asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" "Is that your idea," Jesus said, "or did others talk to you about me?" "Am I a Jew?" Pilate replied. "Your own people and chief priests handed you over. What is it you have done?" Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jewish leaders. But my kingdom is from another place." "You are a king then," said Pilate. Jesus answered, "You say I'm a king. In fact, the reason I was born and came into this world was to testify to the truth. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me." "What is truth?" retorted Pilate. With this, he went out to the Jews and gathered there and said, "I find no basis for charging him." The Jewish leaders arrest Jesus primarily because he was a threat to their religious authority. And because his whole ministry, he empowered people to ask questions and to have dignity against the establishment. They take Jesus to the Roman governor and try to convince the governor that Jesus is trying to take his political power. They tell Pilate Jesus is trying to be a king, and yet Pilate is the rightful king. So Pilate asked Jesus, "Are you claiming to be the rightful king of the Jewish people?" Jesus says, "Why are you asking this? Is it because other people have told you this rumor that I'm trying to overthrow you, or because you actually look at my life and teaching and think that this is the case?" Pilate gets frustrated and says, "I'm not Jewish. I don't know what's going on. You've clearly made your own people mad. What is it that you've done?" And Jesus says, "What I'm trying to do is not overthrow kings or become a high-powered religious ruler. If that's what I was trying to do, my followers would be fighting you right now." Pilate hears this and thinks that Jesus, because he has these followers, is still claiming to be a king of some sorts. Jesus says, "You're the only one saying I'm a king. I have only one purpose, to speak truth in this era of lies, and those who listen to my truth and walk in my way, they will experience life." And Pilate says, "What is truth?" Not what is the truth, but what is truth, the objective truth. That same question is asked in our era, isn't it? We all see things so differently, it's hard to believe that anyone could absolutely come to the truth. But what's more interesting is what Jesus claims. That the revolution he was bringing is not one based on worldly systems, but it is one against a different kind of enemy. The revolution Jesus is waging begins internally. It began by helping people understand inside what ultimate truth actually is. Because if we could see with clarity ultimate truth, then perhaps we could actually work together and align our actions and our lives in the real world with that truth. You see, the problem in the world today is that we're raging against one another without any understanding of what is ultimately true. We're trying to create a revolution by scapegoating one another, by blaming billionaires or immigrants or moderates or socialists, without understanding what the foundation of truth is to the world that we're living in. But according to Jesus, these people aren't the problems. Hear me. Moderates are not the problem. Socialists are not the problem. Republicans are not the problem. The president isn't even the problem. The problem is that none of us know what is true. And without the knowledge of truth, we'll remain locked in the chains of deception and lies, believing that through sheer power and human strength, we can somehow create a better world. But Jesus says freedom only comes through truth. In John 8:31, he says, "If you abide in my word, then you are truly my disciples, and you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free." Then they answered, "We are the offspring of Abraham, and we've never been enslaved. How is it that you can say we will become free?" Jesus said, "Truly I say to you, everyone who practices sin is a slave to sin. A slave does not remain in the house forever, but the Son remains forever. So if the Son sets you free, you will be free indeed. I know that you're Abraham's offsprings, yet you seek to kill me, because my word finds no place in you. I speak what I've seen with my Father, and you do what you have heard from your father." Jesus says if we abide in his word, live according to what he taught, we can experience freedom. When his Jewish disciples heard this, they said, "We've always followed the teachings of Abraham, our own prophet. We're already free." Jesus said, they said, "We've been always doing this way of thinking. We've always been faithful. We've always been aligned with the right party. How dare you come along and say that you have a more sufficient way to lead us into freedom?" Jesus says, yes, of course, you've always been faithful to Abraham. In modern terms, he might say you've always been good Democrats. You've always been good socialists. You've always been good Republicans. And that is what's keeping you from seeing the truth that I'm speaking to you. And that's why you want to kill me. Could it be, church, that we've staked our hope on the ideas of a party, of our candidate, of our ideology, and in so doing stopped following Jesus? Could at least part of the political mess we find ourselves in be a result of us staking our hope on the frail ideas of parties or leaders rather than the truth that we find in the way of Jesus? How would our own lives change if we realized that all of these leaders and all of these parties fall significantly short and provide insufficient answers? And if we engage that way, knowing that to be true, wouldn't we be a little less angry? A little less divided? A little less emotionally tied to our political candidate, thinking that they might be the Messiah to save us? I know hearing these words isn't easy. When the Jewish people heard Jesus say things like this, they tried to kill him. So for me to say Democrats don't have the answers to our problems, and neither do Republicans, that can be infuriating. To say that not a ton will be different no matter what happens at the other side of this election will make us feel pretty perturbed. But I think we all know at some level it's true. Because the problem is far bigger than people or policies. The problem is that we failed to live from truth. Because frankly, the truth is hard to live from. What's the truth I'm speaking of? Jesus says it pretty clearly. You've probably heard this in John 14:6. Thomas says to Jesus, "Lord, where are you going? How can we know the way?" And Jesus said, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." Most of us learn this scripture in a context to interpret it meaning that if someone doesn't believe or follow Jesus, they're going to hell. But that's not what Jesus is getting at here. Jesus is saying that the way to the Father, which is to say the way to living in the way that our Creator desired us to live, is through following Jesus. Jesus is truth. The way he lived, the way he loved others, the way he sacrificed himself, the way he spoke of hope, the way he condemned unjust systems. If we want this world to be transformed, if you want to see your life transformed, we have to do it through the way of Jesus. He is the truth. Christians believe he's the literal incarnation, the embodiment of the way God designed us to live. So why is it so hard to walk in Jesus' way? Why do we so willfully reject what Jesus teaches? Because even as popular as Jesus seems to be if you ask people on the streets in our world today, many people actually like what he taught and his theory of change. Everyone in his day literally hated him. And he told us that if we follow this path, others will hate us as well. Why? Because Jesus teaches us that the only way true change is going to happen in our world is, listen for this, loving our enemies. Do you know what that means? It means loving, being willing to sacrifice ourselves for the good of those who are against us. Jesus teaches us to resist the pull of our society, to seek wealth and security for ourselves. We're called to rely on the provision of God while giving our time and our money and our energy to ensure that others are provided for, even people whom we might find difficult or frustrating. Jesus teaches us to engage in political and civic responsibilities that we all have, even in unjust systems, which means paying our taxes and voting for who we think aligns with our values, while also really realizing that true change and justice only will come when we align our lives with the values of Jesus. None of this feels really great to hear, and it's not all that fun to say. In our day, many of us rightfully have outrage and pain. We feel like the only response is to tear things down. And hear me, that rage is justified. Jesus himself raged when he saw economic exploitation in the temple. Jesus spoke clearly and powerfully truth to power. He called out injustice wherever he saw it. But he also realized that the problem wasn't ultimately politics. The problem wasn't ultimately religious. It was far bigger than that, far more universal. It was that people didn't know the deepest truth. Or rather, many people knew the truth and chose to suppress it. The truth is that every person is made in the image and likeness of God and therefore deserves respect and dignity. The truth is that God so loves the world, which means even our enemies and even our opponents, and calls us into subversive radical love as well. The truth is that change has never, ever, ever come from the top down, but through humble service and sacrifice demonstrated by the life of Jesus. You see, the revolution Jesus launched, the revolution the world so desperately needs today, is much less sexy looking than those being offered by the candidates who are seeking to bring all sorts of revolutions on the left and the right. The revolution Jesus launched looks like not demonizing and speaking toxic words to our others. Instead, it looks like washing their feet and listening to their story. The kingdom Jesus inaugurated looks less like the one that comes with political force and more like a seed planted in the ground that grows slowly, surely into a strong tree through persistent hope and through acts of service. The kingdom Jesus inaugurated is one of the broadest coalitions. It's a kingdom for conservatives and liberals, all races and socioeconomic statuses, all religions and all sexualities, coming together to shine the image of God and to see the image of God in the faces of each other, and realizing ultimately that we all have more in common than what divides us. If you want your life to have a little bit more hope, if you want to bring a little actual change to your world, today I want to say, stop trusting that candidates will ultimately deliver it. Stop buying into the division and demonizing narratives that are being used to manipulate us. Instead, turn off the news for a second and go serve somebody. Knock on doors and listen to people's real stories. Learn about their lives. Stop reading Facebook comments and spend time saturating yourself with the life and the example of Jesus. Get a glimpse of how God desires this world to be. And be intentional about doing your part to make God's dream a reality. I'm not saying, by the way, disengage politically. Jesus commands us to be engaged. Render unto Caesar what is Caesar. I hope we all vote this week in the election. It's part of what it means to be a citizen in America. But what I'm saying is to cease staking your hope on an election. Cease giving your responsibility over to a candidate and letting them take the responsibility for all your burdens and hopes. Because you have far more power than a candidate does to actually make change in the world. And it starts by believing in ultimate truth, by knowing and following Jesus. And this might sound overly simplistic, but I promise you, following Jesus is far from simple. You might think you know what it is to follow Jesus. But the question I want to pose to each of us in this season is, if that's true, then why have we been placing our hope in everywhere except in Jesus? Why have we been placing our hope in the polls, or in elections, or in politics? Because if that's where our hope is, then we've been taken captive by the anxieties of the world, and we've forgotten ultimate truth. So as we enter into this election season, as we enter into this Christian season called Lent, I want to challenge every one of us to take some time and reflect honestly and intentionally on the life and teachings of Jesus. Not just read them, but try to live them out. Today, as you leave service, if you don't have a physical copy of the scriptures, we have these really cool, they're large print even though they're rather small, copies of the Gospel of John, which has the life and teachings of Jesus. I want to encourage you to pick one up. Take one with you. And if you have your own Bible at home, I want to encourage you to jump into the Gospel of John as well. And I want to challenge you to read one chapter every day. There are 21 chapters in the book, so this will take you from today to March 21st. Take the chapter, and then as you read it, find one practical thing from Jesus' life and teaching that you can implement that day. And I believe that the more we practice, the more we center on the words of Jesus in this season where everyone's going to be speaking all sorts of mistruths and trying to pull us off the course, I believe we will find more hope and more peace and a better vision for our own lives and how we can impact our world. The more change we'll begin to see as we recenter and reorient our lives on Christ. So let's do this together as an act of resistance, and a resistance to the lies that are seeking to divide us and all the lies that we're going to be enticed to believe in this season. If we do this, we'll become the people that Jesus calls us to be, people of sacrifice, people who embody God's love, people who demonstrate to our friends and our workplace and our world that there is a better way, a better reality. As the great theologian John Howard Yoder once said in his book, The Politics of Jesus, the cross is not a detour or hurdle on the way to the kingdom, nor is it even the way to the kingdom. It is the kingdom come. The cross, the way of sacrificial love, is how we bring this kingdom that Jesus spoke about before Pilate. It's how we transform our communities, our cultures, our family, and our world. This is what we need in this season. A little less yelling, tweeting, and a little bit more foot washing and sacrificing for each other. So let's lean into this together, Mission Gathering. Let's participate in the revolution that Jesus began 2,000 years ago that has been transforming the world ever since. Are you with me? Amen. Pray with me. Dear God, in this season, there is so much that's causing anxiety and distracting us from what is real and what is true. And God, I just pray for everyone gathered in this room, for our friends and our families and our country and our world, that as we center on your ways, as we seek to follow Jesus, may we be able to be a balm that can bring healing to the divisions that are in the midst of this nation right now. Lord, would you move through us as we seek to follow you? Would you grant us wisdom and guidance and boldness to follow you even when it's not comfortable and even when it challenges everything that we think we know and think feels right? God, would we follow you and trust in your way? And would you match our obedience with your power and bring transformation to our lives and to this world? So God, be with us in this season. Tear down the walls of division. Guide us, we ask. In Jesus' name.